Hello everyone. Um, Now we will talk about a variation or a model of deontological ethics. We have talked about deontological ethics earlier, and now we would like to see a model of non-consequential or deontological ethics. Now, there is a philosopher called W. D. Ross, who has postulated a theory of ethical rules, right, which is called the prima facie duties. So, prima facie in Latin means in first glance. So, let me read out what does this is an example of deontological theories. If you remember, as you recollect, deontological theories are theories that hold something as intrinsically valuable, duty intrinsically valuable. So, something that is intrinsically valuable, that is crucial about deontological ethics. But now in deontological ethics there are various theories, as we had come across. Immanuel Kant was one of the leading proponents of deontological ethics. He had his own version of deontological ethics. Ethical rules are also another version of deontological ethics. So, deontological ethics is a blanket or an umbrella term, and there are many ethical theories that have been developed within it. So, deontological ethics tells us a format of ethics, that ethics which are intrinsically valuable. But what is intrinsically valuable? That is to be articulated by a theory. So, please keep this in mind in case there is ever a confusion between whether deontological ethics is theory or say ethical rules by Ross is a theory, prima facie duty. So, what is intrinsically valuable? Is described by the theory. So, for W. D. Ross, some ethical rules that he gives out is what is intrinsically valuable. So, let me give you a brief overview about what is the rationale and why, what is special, or what is the ethical rules got to do with. I will frequently be using the word prima facie duty, so that it not only signifies the theory, but it also makes sense, because by calling it W. D. Ross, it also it just gives us a name, but not the meaning in it. And I will take a side step here and also tell you that you might have come across, as you enter and progress in your theoretical studies, that very often you look at a person's name as a framework, right. So, you have a Newtonian worldview, you have an Einsteinian worldview, you have a Kantian worldview, right. So, you may have heard a Descartes system. So, when we look at to take people's name as looking at a system, it is not only giving a credit, not only acknowledging the founder of the system, but also describing the philosophy of the system, right. So, the Newtonian worldview or Newtonian mechanics would be different from, say, Einsteinian worldview, and here the founder and the philosophy of that particular system is symbolized by the founder, right. So, when I say a Kantian system or Mill's utilitarianism, in Mill's utilitarianism, so that particular person is not just being accredited for being the founder, but is also a part of is not just is not being the founder, but also being the is also giving a system of So, when we symbolize a system with a person's or the founder's name, it is not only to pay respect to the founder, but also to describe it as a shorthand for a philosophy. So, the Newtonian philosophy of looking at the world is different from the Einsteinian philosophy, Descartes' philosophy of looking at the world. So, each founder also gives a philosophy of looking at the world. So, here that is why we have names of people attached with theories, not just because they are the founders, but also it gives a neat shorthand for what that particular philosophy of that theory is. So, instead of talking about the Rossian theory, I will stick to the terminology prima facie duties here. So, that it also because the noun would not mean much to you, but prima facie duties will help you make sense of it even more. So, prima facie duties is about the first glance, the duties that you have in the first glance. Prima facie duties are duties that become apparent or evident on the first encounter with a moral dilemma. Ross' view is that our actual moral duty in any situation has to arrive by weighing our prima facie duties and deciding which is most important. Yes, I missed introducing the big picture of the particular theory. Now, look at Ross with his theory of prima facie duties. What does he want to do? Let us have the fundamental question sorted out. Ross wants to put up a theory of decision making, moral decision making. He gives a set of laws that are to be followed. So, to bring some sort of a these laws that he gives, or the rules, ethical rules that he gives, these are describing what is intrinsically valuable, right. So, what is Ross' contribution? The prima facie duties are giving content to the intrinsic values, that these are intrinsic values to be followed. So, in the broader ambit of deontological ethics, Ross introduces a theory where he gives a set of laws or rules which are intrinsically valuable, only we need to calibrate it depending on the situation. So, he gives something which is intrinsically valuable, and that is why his theory is a deontological theory, because he gives something which is intrinsically valuable. So, our actual moral duty, Ross' view is that our actual moral duty in any situation has to be arrived at by weighing our prima facie duties and deciding which is the most important. So, here is a B that should be, has to be arrived at by weighing our prima facie duties and deciding which is the most important, right. So, how does this come out to be? Let us say, how do you take a decision? We will come to the list of laws, maybe I will just show you a glimpse of the laws that he talks about before we make the decision. I think that will. So, he lists out these are the duties according to Ross, right. So, he puts out a set of 6 duties, the first duty being having 2 parts. Let me briefly go over them so that they can make sense to you, right, that these are things which are intrinsically valuable. These are duties to be done no matter what, right. So, the choice is not between doing this or not, but between choosing which duty over the other, calibrating. That is the only freedom or the discretion that a human agent has. So, this prima facie duties theory is giving us almost a compass, a way to make a moral decision, right. That if we have a moral, if we have a circumstance or a moral situation, how do we think through it? We apply that prima facie, these are the laws that rules that will be applied, and within these laws or rules, we need to decide which one has to be given precedence over the other, right. So, let us say, let us quickly briefly look at what are the duties that Ross talks about. Duties from the previous acts of the agent, that means things that come from the past. Duties of fidelity, that means keeping one's commitment, implicit or explicit, and duties of reparation. Duties of reparation, what is duties of reparation? Making good a wrongful act. Let us think of an example, that if you have wronged somebody, you have a fundamental duty to correct that wrong, to make right that wrong. That is a something that comes from your previous acts, right. Duties of fidelity, because you have made a commitment, so you need to live up to it. So, this is the primary or the first duty that comes about, the duties from previous acts of the agent. Second, it is duties of gratitude. So, repay obligations. So, first is the duties that come from first is the duty that comes from the previous acts of the agent, and the second is duties of gratitude, that where you have received something, you need to repay obligations. So, this is the duties of gratitude. Then comes the duties of justice. Duties of justice talks about preventing inequitable distribution. So, wherever one is in the position to take step to prevent inequitable distribution. These are the duties of justice that that is intrinsically valuable, that all of these are intrinsically valuable duties. Duties of beneficence or make better the lives of other beings. So, sorry. Okay. So, duties of beneficence, that how can you affect and help make better the lives of others. Then there is the duties of self improvement, that how do you cause your own growth in the agent's own virtues or intelligence, right. So, there is a duty towards one's self growth also, and finally, duties of maleficence, that you are not to injure others. So, these are the duties, 6 duties, with the first one having 2 parts, that Ross lists out as something which is intrinsically valuable and which needs to be followed, right. But then the question comes, how do you decide on this? Perhaps it will you may like to pause the video and go through these 6 duties, which apparently appear simple, but they are quite beautifully conceptually connected and give a step by step notion of what is intrinsically valuable, that these things need to be done irrespective of the consequences that they bring about. These are our fundamental duties, and that is why you would notice the term duties attached to each of these particular claim. So, when we talk about duties of non-maleficence, that means not injuring others. So, that is also a part of our duty. So, for Ross, this is a simplified version of Ross theory, so that one gets to understand what kind of what kind of a theory is a deontological theory. Now, having given these duties, that we come across these duties as something which is intrinsically valuable, how do we make a decision? And here we will go back to the previous slide that talks about what about the decision, how is the decision to be taken. The decision is to be taken by the agent in due cognizance of the particular situation. Is this set of 6 rules algorithmic and magical, that you just feed it into the form of an algorithm and it should be able to take decisions? Well, no. Ross has of course been thoughtful enough to understand that this cannot be a mechanical application of these rules. So, not a mechanical application of the rules. So, the decision to be taken by the agent is in due cognizance of a particular situation. What does this mean? Okay, sorry about that. Now, there can be a hierarchy amongst duties when other components are equal. That means, there can be a hierarchy. However, that hierarchy is not an absolute hierarchy amongst duties. So, there is a decision that has to be taken by the moral agent. The ethical rules mentioned, the 6 ethical rules are intrinsically valuable, but they are not mechanically or automatically applicable to a circumstance. The agent has to take due cognizance, that means, has to be aware to factor in what is the duty that should take precedence over the other if there is a need for recalibration, and then apply these particular duties, right. There can be a hierarchy amongst duties when other components are equal. That means, given that other components are equal, then we can follow the same law of application of duties, say number 1 goes first, 2 goes second and third, but there can be no absolute hierarchy amongst the duties. Now, so what is the upshot? Well, is it the middle path that Ross is talking about? Ross theory remains absolutistic, yet attempts to cater to the particularities of varied moral dilemmas. I will pause here to spend a moment on this particular point. Does this sound paradoxical or self contradictory? Let us take a look at this. Ross theory remains absolutistic. It is absolutistic. Why is it absolutistic? Because it gives 6 rules to be followed. Yet attempts to cater the particularities of a varied moral dilemmas. So, that means moral dilemmas can differ. How does Ross theory attempt to cater to this varieties of moral dilemma? By keeping the hierarchy between theories, between these rules as situation dependent, right. So, agent dependent. So, the rules are absolute, but the hierarchy depends on the particular situation. This is what makes it, this makes it absolute, this makes it accommodative. That is a very interesting combination that puts up. When one has absolute roles, or when one has absolute rules, they tend not to be accommodative. They cannot accommodate the peculiarities of a situation, right. So, let us take a standard example, and that is why always please connect these theories with lived experiences. Somebody is come late to the class, right. There can be a an absolute rule that anybody who has come late to the class will not be given attendance, right. That is an absolute rule, but that rule can also be foolish or ineffective when it does not take into account the particularities of a situation. Suppose there is a political protest outside the college and everybody is held up, and therefore, or at least a batch of students are held up. Now, if they come in late, that is when the teacher takes a decision that yes, we have a law that anybody who is late to class will not be marked present, but in these circumstances she or he, the students may be marked present. That is what is the accommodative component. So, absolute rules are simple, but they do not have the power of accommodation or taking care of the particularities of a situation. But how then is the hierarchy amongst the rules decided? That is the question, that how do we decide the hierarchy amongst the rules? That is a valid question that comes about. Now, is it moral intuition? Is it moral intuition that how do you decide the moral hierarchy? Do we have a moral sense that moral qualities supervene on sensible qualities? Are we making essentially moral judgments? Can there ever be a uniformity in moral judgments? Now, this is a question, an angle of critique that I leave open to you, because this is where you will sit on judgment on a theory and to critique or to find the limits of. So, remember another crucial distinction, that when I use the word, or when the word critique is used of, it does not mean criticize, right. It does not mean criticize, rather it means to set the limits of. This is what my teacher had once taught me, a clarity that helps me use the word critique very sensibly. Critique is not an act of criticism, which in colloquial language very often is used as to always play the devil's advocate or always find fault with a established claim. To critique a theory, or as used in academic literature, is to set the limits of. So, when I critique the prima facie duties theory, I would say that the one point used is, well, how does one recalibrate or use the application of the moral rules given by Ross? Do we have a moral sense? Do moral qualities supervene on sensible qualities? Are we essentially making moral judgments? Can there be a uniformity in judgments? That means, if somebody would hold duties of reparation in this particular circumstance as secondary to say duties of justice, whereas somebody else may hold it the other way around. So, these are the difficulties that also come with Ross theory, but we are not here doing a specialized study of prima facie duties of Ross. Rather, we are trying to look at an example of what an example of deontological ethics is. So, finally, a uniformity or uniformity in judgments requires a uniformity in human nature. So, that means for Ross, what are the assumptions that Ross is probably holding? That he holds that a uniformity in judgments will require a uniformity in human nature. Our moral ideas and moral judgments are based on certain common facts about human nature. So, our moral ideas and moral judgments are based on certain common facts about human nature. Within our enormous variety lies some essential similarities, and that is the source of our morality. So, the critique that was raised in the earlier page is now trying to be answered, that well, a uniformity in judgment requires a uniformity in human nature. What was the critique? The critique was that well, different people may value hierarchies differently in different circumstances. So, arguing for Ross, one could say that well, Ross expects or requires that a uniformity in judgment requires a uniformity in human nature. Is that too much to ask for? No, because it is not saying that all of us are identical, but our moral ideas and moral judgments are based on certain common facts about the human nature. What are certain common facts? That say we find unprovoked violence incorrect. There may be outliers, there may be people or moral agents who may disagree with it, but when we make a law, we look at which is almost a universally accepted claim. Perhaps nothing is universally accepted, there will be truant reasoning, there will be peculiarly different people. So, within our enormous variety, so this acknowledges that there is an enormous variety in the kind of people we are. Still there are some essential similarities, and that is the source of our morality. So, essential similarities, and that is the source of our morality. So, with this we come to understand what Ross theory about prima facie duties is, which is a typical example of deontological ethics. So, I hope you have had a brief idea about what deontological ethics is, and take a look at or understood an example of deontological ethics, which is prima facie duties theory by W. D. Ross. A simple rendition of it that will help you make sense of it, right. So, with this we end our discussion of W. D. Ross prima facie duties theory of ethical rules, which is an example of deontological ethics. Thank you.